Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now today we're comparing 2020's RTX 3060 Ti to the newly released RTX 5060. Now back in 2020 the RTX 3060 Ti was pretty hard to find. I think I found one eventually and was quite lucky to do so, and fast forward 5 years and it remains one of my favourite cards. It has 8 gigs of VRAM of course, and these days it may put some people off, but if we look at some gameplay here you'll see that it is still quite capable, especially at 1080p with native resolution. We looked at the 5060 the other day in comparison to the 4060 and found that despite the 8 gigs of VRAM there was still a noticeable difference in the games that I played. I don't think the 5060 is necessarily a bad card, but I would have liked to see more VRAM, because if you have an on-screen overlay enabled you may find yourself glancing at it every so often thinking, we're getting pretty close to that max VRAM buffer right now. For higher resolutions and higher settings you may run into a few issues. I can't help but feel we're going around in circles a little bit, especially when you think of cards like the 3070 or indeed the 3060 Ti here. It seems like we should have moved on from 8 gigs at a minimum, even at this price point, to be honest. That said, if the 5060 was 200 quid instead of 269, it would be an absolute banger. Today, however, we are comparing the 5060 to the 3060 Ti because the 3060 Ti is a better card than the 4060, and I thought it'd be interesting to see again how these two stack up against each other at native 1080p resolution. When you ignore all the frame gen stuff and just look at pure native performance, how do these two compare in a battle across a handful of titles? So we'll finish up with the 3060 Ti gameplay here. As you can see, still a pretty capable card, but let's switch to the 5060 gameplay now, and we'll throw the comparative figures up on screen as we look at the RTX 5060 gameplay. The 5060 of course an 8GB GDDR7 card compared to the 3060 Ti, which is an 8GB GDDR6 card. It did come in a GDDR6X variant as well, although we've tested that before and there was about 1 to 5 FPS difference with the GDDR6X model, but this is the OG R6 GDDR6 card, so bear that in mind too. The results will probably be even closer if you can find a GDDR6X version, but I don't want to give too much away, spoiler alert, you know. GTA 5 enhanced then to start with, 1080p with the maximum RT preset and DLAA. The RTX 5060 hit 94 frames per second on average with a 1% low of 77 and a 0.1% low of 74. I'm testing with an i9-14900K, but I have limited the CPU to 125 watts because I'm using a 15 quid air cooler, and as capable as it is, it can't really keep the i9 cool when it's running at its maximum power. Yeah, limited it to 125 watts, but it's still more than enough to get the most out of these cards. I'm also using 32 gigs of 6000 MHz DDR5 in dual channel. I wanted to make sure that we weren't running into any CPU bottlenecks for the sake of our GPU comparison. When we look at the 3060 Ti results, 79 FPS here with a 1% low of 64 and a 0.1% low of 62. So still a very consistent result for the 3060 Ti, but it's falling short by about 14-15 frames per second here. A good effort nonetheless. For Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, the results were a little closer here at the Ultra preset with SMAA 2TX because we get a few more frames than we do with DLAA enabled. We saw 82 frames per second for the new 5060 8GB, a 1% low of 68 and a 0.1% low of 62. In comparison to the 3060 Ti, we were getting about 10 FPS less, 72 with that card, a 1% low of 60 and a 0.1% low of 57. Still, considering there's about 4.5 year age gap between these two cards, there's not really that significant of a performance gap between them, or not as much as I would have liked to see anyway, put it that way. Seems like we should be getting a lot better. Seems like that gap should be a lot larger, but it will depend on the game, of course. Moving on to The Witcher 3 Next Gen, and again the performance gap depletes ever so slightly once more. This time we're getting about 9 frames per second on average more with the RTX 5060 compared to the 3060 Ti. We're seeing 65 FPS with the RT preset and TAAU with the 5060, a 1% low of 53 and a 0.1% low of 48, so can't really fault the consistency of the performance here. The frame times are pretty decent, as are represented by the smooth on-screen frame time graph at the centre left of your screen. The 3060 Ti, 56 frames per second overall, a 1% low of 45 and a 0.1% low of 39. Now this is definitely a difference that could be made up with DLSS. You enable DLSS quality and you're probably going to be matching the 5060 in most cases, but of course the 5060 also has a DLSS. Oblivion Remastered up next at the high preset with DLAA enabled. The 5060 hits 68 frames per second. Now I have redone all the testing. I'm not just using the same tests that I conducted the other day. I've actually retested all the games that we're looking at in today's one. So 68 frames per second here. This is where the consistency falls apart. Oblivion Remastered is a bit of a mess performance wise. So 46 is that 1% low and a 0.1% low of 26. So yeah, definitely noticeable dips and drops in and around the entirety of the map here. The 3060 Ti hit 58 frames per second, so again about a 10 FPS difference here. And when it comes to those percentile lows, well, the 1% low was actually very similar, 45 compared to the 5060 46. And again, we had some stutter here too, a 0.1% low of just 19. Not good. We'll move on to Doom the Dark Ages next. Now actually playing this and I felt like the results were similar, but as it turns out there was still a 10 FPS difference according to the benchmark. Both cards will exhibit dips and drops below 60 FPS, but the 5060, 66 FPS overall, a 1% low of 54 and a 0.1% low of 48. When we look at the 3060 Ti results, we're getting 56, so still a respectable average, a 1% low of 45 and a 0.1% low of 35. So a few more dips and drops for this card, but I think it's still decent performance to be honest. Especially when you consider the age of this GPU. Coming up to half a decade old and I think still quite impressive. Red Dead Redemption 2 next, the Ultra setting still looks fantastic in my opinion. With TAA high here, the RTX 5060 was getting 84 FPS with a 1% low of 67 and a 0.1% low of 61. So can't fault the consistency again here. The 3060 Ti managed 76 frames per second. So we're looking at a difference of about 8 frames per second here if my mathematics are correct. 60 frames per second for that 1% low. So about 7 FPS gap between the two cards, and the gap shrinks even more to 4 FPS when we look at the 0.1% low frame rate. So a good result for both, but that 3060 Ti still hanging in there very well, especially when it comes to running with ultra settings at 1080p for Red Dead 2. We've got a couple of results for Cyberpunk 2077. The first is with the Ultra preset with ray tracing turned off. Now with a 5060 we saw 96 frames per second the other day. The average was quite a bit lower than this because I enabled DLAA, and that takes quite the toll on the performance in this game. If we disable DLAA and just run with the standard anti-aliasing solution, whatever that is here, yeah, we're seeing 96 FPS, which is up from, I think it was about 70 something, maybe 80 something the other day. Again, consistency wise it's okay. 68 FPS is that 1% low and a 0.1% low of 60. The 3060 Ti managed 78 frames per second, so this is where our difference is increasing yet again. This is something I noticed with the 4060 as well. There was quite a big difference between the two cards. Here we're looking at 78 FPS overall, so between 15 and 20 frames per second difference. The 1% low was 59 and the 0.1% low was 53, but again still pretty solid, I think. We'll then look at the RT Ultra preset results because this is where things get even closer. We're basically using up all of the VRAM on both cards here. 47 FPS with a 1% low of 33 and a 0.1% low of 29. For the 3060 Ti, we were just a few frames behind, 43 overall with a 1% low of 35. So it actually did better in terms of that 1% figure and fell slightly short again with that 0.1% low number, 24 compared to 29. To finalise then, we'll take a look at Call of Duty Black Ops 6, 1080p with the Ultra preset, 119 frames per second for the new 5060, a 1% low of 89 and a 0.1% low of 73. The 3060 Ti, for some reason I wrote 4060 here, so I'll have to correct that before that makes it into the final editing. There we go, we'll just correct that. Yeah, 101 frames per second for the 3060 Ti, a 1% low of 79 and a 0.1% low of 73. Interestingly, the 0.1% lows were the same for both cards, 73 for each of them. There we are, the 3060 Ti compared to the 5060 at 1080p in a handful of my current favourite games. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. There are some pretty interesting results I feel here. I will have a broader test suite with the 5060 coming soon. I want to test 20 or 30 games at 1080p and then perhaps at 1440p as well at some point, but haven't had much time with this card yet, so just wanted to put a few different videos out there to give you an idea of where it sits in the grand scheme of things. So as always, thanks for watching. Let me know your thoughts down below. I love to read through your comments. Like the video if you enjoyed it, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already and you want to, of course. And with all that said, hopefully I'll see you all in the next one.